You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What does freedom mean when the deck is stacked against you? To commemorate Black History Month, we're revisiting a story that's too often overlooked, but critical to our understanding of early America. While we often think of early American society in terms of stark contrasts, enslaved or free, wealthy or poor, the reality was far more complex. In this episode, we'll revisit episode 328 from 2022 to uncover the lives of free people of color in early America. These were Black people who were free from enslavement, but who stood in the shadow of slavery, where they carved out lives of resilience and purpose. Now, since we spoke in 2022, Warren Miltier Jr. is now an associate professor of history at George Washington University. Using details from his books, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Warren leads us on a journey from the colonial era through the American Revolution and into the pre-Civil War period. Now, during our journey, Warren reveals where free people of color lived and thrived, the surprising opportunities free people of color seized during the American Revolution, and the legal battles they faced just to exist in early American society. This is a story of courage, determination, and what it truly means to fight for a place in the world. I hope you enjoy as we revisit our conversation with Warren and re-explore the complexities and contradictions of freedom in early America. Our guest is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. His research expertise is in the early American South, free people of color, race, slavery, and Native America. He's the author of numerous articles and 2 books, North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, and Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Warren Miltier Jr.
Thank you for having me.
So, Warren, I wonder if we could begin with a little myth busting. It seems that many Americans assume that before the Civil War, in that antebellum period, free people of color lived in northern free states, while all enslaved people in the United States lived in southern slave states. Could you help us better understand the reality of where free people of color actually lived in early America and what freedom meant in different parts of the young United States?
Yeah, so free people of color were located in both the North and the South from the colonial period all the way through the Civil War. We don't really know exactly how many free people of color were in the colonies during that period, but by the time we get to the Civil War era, the majority of free people of color are living in the South and not in the North, which, like you said, I don't think a lot of people are aware of. And they're spread across the region. As far as the South goes, there are large populations of free people of color in places like Maryland and Virginia, North Carolina. But then you also have significant populations of free people of color in Pennsylvania, New York, later Ohio as well.
Now, before we really dig into the lives and experiences of free people of color, most of whom lived in the South, I wonder if we could talk about the term free people of color, because this is a term you use in both of your books, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Beyond Slavery's Shadow. And I wonder if you could define that term for us and tell us who early Americans thought of as a free person of color.
Well, I think one thing I try to emphasize in both books is the diversity of free people of color. I think that many people don't know what free people of color means, but also there are people who have seen the term or are somewhat familiar with the term, but don't recognize how different many of the people were who fell under this category of free people of color. And part of that is ancestral diversity. I mean, there is a wide range of ancestries people who end up being categorized as free people of color, I discussed the fact that this term could include both people of African descent as well as people of Native American descent. And so you have some people who may be one or the other. Many people have both ancestries. And then on top of that, there are a few free people of color who also seem to have had some connection to Asia, specifically South Asian areas that we would probably think of as India today. And so I think that diversity, recognizing that diversity is very important because it tells us a lot about the story of people of African descent and how it's more complicated than just the story of enslavement. But also it says something about Native American history and the fact that the lives of Native American people in the South and also in the United States more broadly went in a variety of different directions. All people who were of Native American ancestry ultimately were not categorized as Indians, which is something that a lot of people don't think about. And then also going on with that diversity is, again, the importance of economic diversity amongst free people of color and how that determined their lives. But that's something that I really want people to take away from my work, is to recognize that free people of color had diverse lives, different lives that often were controlled by how wealthy they were or how poor they were. And it impacted their lives in that time and potentially impacts the lives of their descendants in the present.
You've told us that free people of color really encompasses a broad range of peoples with different ancestries. And I wonder why you think it is that we've mostly come to understand free people of color as meaning free Black people instead of this great diversity that you just told us about.
Probably some of that just comes from assumptions that we make based on how terms such as colored were used in the 20th century. I think that most people strongly associate the term colored in the 20th century with people of African descent. And so we haven't gone back and looked at the way that the term colored was used or people of color was used in that earlier time period. But it's quite obvious from the sources that this term had a much broader meaning than the way that we assume it. And to some extent, it makes sense because we see how the term people of color is used in the 21st century. And in many cases, it is a term that encompasses people of a variety of different backgrounds, which is clearly connected to how it was used originally in an earlier period.
Okay, so you mentioned at the outset that by the Civil War, most free people of color actually live in the South and not in northern cities. Because, when we think of free people of color, I think many of us immediately picture places like New York City and Philadelphia, where free people of color really formed significant communities. So what was it like for the majority of free people of color to live in and form communities across the southern part of the United States?
It really depends on where you're looking. You have populations that are more centralized in some of the cities of the South, such as Charleston, New Orleans, and most importantly, Baltimore, which had the largest population of free people of color as far as the city goes in the South. But many free people of color were living in rural areas of the region as well. And there's some surprising places that pop up on the list of, say, the top 10, top 20, top 50 localities for free people of color in the South. Many rural counties in Maryland had significant populations of free people of color. Delaware, which for the most part is a rural state outside of Wilmington, Virginia as well, you will see those types of patterns. So yeah, free people of color are scattered across the country, scattered across the South. They are doing different types of work depending on where they're living and involved in different types of relationships with their neighbors based on those contexts as well.
I'd love for us to get into the specifics of lived experiences in the South, and I wonder if we could begin with the story of King Tony. Now, in Beyond Slavery's Shadow, one of your two books, Warren, you shared the story of King Tony, who was a free person of color who happened to live in Virginia during the 17th century. Would you tell us about King Tony and about his life as a free person of color living in colonial Virginia?
Yeah, so King Tony, as you said, was living in Virginia in the late 17th century, specifically in Northampton County, Virginia, which is on Virginia's eastern shore. And that particular area has received significant attention from historians, for one, because the records are relatively good, and two, because you do have this early population of free people of color in that community. And so King Tony is one of several free people of color in Northampton County. He's a landowner. He wrote a will, so that's how we know about him and his family connections. He left property to his family upon his death. So that's basically what we know is we know this larger context that he's living in with other free people of color, and also that he was a property owning person at a time when we wouldn't necessarily imagine to find people of color owning land and being able to pass it down to their families for generations to come.
Is there any evidence that you were able to find on whether King Tony's ability to pass down land to his family helped secure the free status of his family going forward into the 18th and early 19th centuries?
I would say it's possible. I haven't looked very closely into King Tony's descendants and what happened to them specifically. I know that the families that King Tony was connected to did remain in that area for a while, at least some of them.
Some historians argue that it was really in the 17th century, the late 17th century, when conceptions of race-based slavery and ideas about how race is what could determine your status in North American society really developed. And I wonder, what was King Tony's life like during this 17th century period where we do start to see a separation and distinction between white people and people of color?
I think King Tony was living at a time where, like I think your question somewhat suggests, that the laws that are separating free people of color from white people have not been fully developed. Now, there's definitely a conception of slavery, and there are many people of African descent already enslaved in the community where King Tony lived. The majority of them would have been enslaved. But at the same time, there is some flexibility, some respect to the fact that King Tony is a free person and that being a free person means something distinct from being an enslaved person. And so I think he would have been able to benefit from that distinction. And on top of that, I mean, King Tony is a man. And so there are certain rules that would have applied to women, especially poor women, that didn't apply to King Tony. And so that put him in a position where he's not necessarily at the top of the social hierarchy, but he's not at the bottom either. He's not where many people might suspect he would be.
Now, moving forward from the late 17th century, I'd like for us to visit the mid to late 18th century and talk about the American Revolution. The Revolution was this period that actually created a lot of opportunities for enslaved people to gain their freedom. You know, they achieved their freedom by self-emancipating or running away to British lines. They could achieve their freedom by serving in the British or Revolutionary armies, or they might have gained their freedom in areas of the United States that abolished and started to gradually emancipate enslaved people beginning as early as the 1780s. What we don't often hear about, though, are the opportunities that would have existed for free people of color during the Revolution. So, Warren, could you tell us how the Revolution would have impacted opportunities and life for free people of color?
Yeah, so free people of color are connected to both sides of the conflict around the revolution. You have some free people of color in the South who end up serving in local militias on the side of the United States. There are a few free people of color who seem to have gone off with the British, especially those who are in the servant class who don't necessarily see opportunity in the revolution. If, their masters will be free and will have more opportunities, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee anything for them. And that's, I think you could see that free people of color are split. I even find evidence of some free people of color who are drafted into the militias of the United States and run away. So there are a lot of different opinions about what revolution means amongst free people of color from the little bit that we know as far as what they say and what evidence they leave about the revolution and their thoughts.
So it sounds like a lot of the choices that would have been available to free people of color were really the choices that any free American was trying to make during this time of the revolution. Like, do they believe in the ideology of the revolutionary or the loyalists? Or maybe what they even want from the post-revolution period?
Yeah, and I mean, largely we don't know what they thought. There are a couple of examples where people will sign loyalty oaths to the United States and things of that nature, but for the average person, we really don't know what the average free person of color thought about the revolution. Many free people of color are not well to do, they're not literate, so they're not leaving us documents to tell us what they think. And because they are people of lower station as far as the social hierarchy is concerned, that puts them in a different position than, say, the characters that we often think about when we think of the American Revolution.
That's a really interesting point, that we can't often know what free people of color thought about the revolution or presumably other events in history because they were often illiterate, or they just didn't have documents to leave behind, or some archive didn't wish to preserve them because, these weren't seen as people of importance. So how do you, as a historian, Warren, someone who researches free people of color, get at the stories of King Tony and other early Americans who are also free people of color?
Yeah, so in the case of King Tony and many other people who are probably of a similar class background, I'm looking at wills and deeds and things of that nature, seeing what types of business interactions these people have in the colonial period and trying to get something out of that. Court records are really important in trying to understand what they think, or at least where they fit in the larger society. And sometimes you can get an inkling about a free person of color's opinion based on maybe a court case where they actually have some testimony there. Or, for instance, I'm just thinking about a more famous case of Anthony Johnson from Northampton County, who would have lived around the same time that King Tony was alive. And he was a free person of color who at least enslaved one person. And so we learned that from the court records, and we can kind of extrapolate his thoughts about the process of enslaving other people from that court case, that he at least was willing to do that to one person and didn't necessarily see it as problematic. So in that sense, we can build something there. Or maybe in the case of a poor free person of color, they show up in the records being charged with a variety of different crimes, often having to do with their poverty, such as free women of color will show up in the records being charged with having children out of wedlock, and their children are being born out of wedlock because of the fact that they're not allowed to marry because they're servants. And so we can see in the court records sometimes these struggles over maintaining control over themselves, controlling their children. So that's how I work with those records and try to build a story about their lives and their thoughts to the best of my ability. But I don't want to go too far by taking that evidence that I have and say I know everything about what they're thinking.
So as we continue to move further in time here from the Revolutionary period to the early Republic, I wonder if the number of records that we have for free people of color increased and maybe even reveal more information about their lives now that we're moving into the early Republic period or the early United States. So is this the case? Do we see more records and more information for free people of color who lived after the colonial period in the early United States?
I would say yes. Overall, the closer we get to the Civil War, the quality of the records in general gets better. You're more likely to find, say, a letter written by a free person of color in 1850 than you are to find one in 1750. And also it depends on the location that you're looking at. So say the records from French Louisiana often are better in quality and detail than records from South Carolina. Not always, but often that is the case. The court cases, even in the context of, say, French or Spanish Louisiana, are more detailed, often include more references to testimony, so we get the actual voices of free people of color, but also white people, enslaved people, Native Americans, versus, say, in a place like South Carolina, where the records are overall actually not very good. Colonial North Carolina, especially the early time period of colonial North Carolina, say the 1600s, you're not going to find much of the voices of free people of color in the records. So, yeah, time helps.
Now, one of the things that the War for Independence did was that it created an independent United States. It created a new nation. Warren, as Americans shifted away from British laws and customs and embraced a more American way of governing, what did this shift mean for the lives and experiences of the United States' free people of color?
I think it varies for different free people of color. In a certain sense, we see benefits that come about because of the American Revolution and just the ideas that are floating around in that time about liberty. It gives free people of color something to attach to that they can use to defend themselves, say in a court case or in public debates about their position. They can go back and reference, hey, this is what we've said was going to happen during the American Revolution, and we now need to live as we claim we were going to live. So in that sense, it's beneficial. But then at the same time, I think the revolution is very disruptive, especially when we're thinking about the evolution of American politics that comes about because of the revolution. So you have people trying to figure out, how do we build new political coalitions in the southern states and all around the country. And sadly, I think it's quite clear that bigotry, often targeted specifically at free people of color, is an important part of early American politics and becomes increasingly important as we get towards the Civil War period. And I don't know if we would see quite the level of development in that politics had the majority of the Southern colonies remained part of Great Britain and under the rule of Great Britain.
I think politics and coalition forming in the new United States was really clearly about trying to figure out how the new nation was going to govern itself and how individual states were going to govern themselves. Did you find any evidence where free people of color in the South in particular had any say in politics? Because they were free people of color and presumably taxpayers too. So in this day and age, they would have had a say, but we know that's not always true of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on which state you're looking at. But at different times, free men of color specifically could vote. So in places like North Carolina, Maryland for a time, free people of color, free men of color could vote and were active in politics as far as being voters, participating in all the functions that go along with voting in a community. They're serving in militias, which people see as very much connected to politics as well. Some of them actually had rank in the militias as far as they're not just privates in the militia. So they would have had power over white people as well as other people of color. So yeah, definitely free people of color have a voice. Some of them, especially individuals more familiar probably to your audience, such as Benjamin Banneker, was quite outspoken about politics, especially the connection between politics and race in the late 1700s. So yeah.
When we talk about slavery, free people of color, and relations between white people and people of color between the periods of the Revolution and the Civil War, we often separate these conversations into two groups, Northern experiences and Southern experiences. But what you just described, that free people of color, particularly men, free men of color could vote in Southern states like Maryland and North Carolina, that may sound to many of us like more of a Northern experience than a Southern experience. And we should note here that not all Northern states did allow free people of color to vote. So Warren, could you tell us more about the regional variations and variations between the states as to the laws and treatment of free people of color?
Basically, what we see, especially if we're thinking about the South, is that different forms of discrimination pop up over time, whether it's disfranchising free men of color and taking away their right to vote, or laws requiring the registration of free people of color. They show up in most southern states at some point, but the process in which they show up is very gradual. So if I had to pick a state that seems to be a leader in discrimination, I would have to point to Virginia. Virginia seems to be the place, as far as when we're thinking about laws being created to discriminate against free people of color. Virginia seems to be the place that is creating some of the earliest legislation around discrimination. And then you will see other states follow. One example that I can think of is around the issue of the movement of free people of color from state to state. So Virginia is one of the earliest states to create rules preventing, or they're supposed to prevent, free people of color from other states coming into Virginia's boundaries. So when Virginia passes its law, then other states start following. Its neighboring states use the Virginia example as a reason to therefore prohibit free people of color from coming into their states. Now, the degree to which these laws are enforced, it varies locally. So even within one state, you can see a lot of variation. Some discriminatory laws, say in Virginia, may be enforced in one part of the state and not enforced in another. But yeah, there's this variation based on different states, but also time. So maybe going back to the issue of disfranchisement, free people of color have been disfranchised in Virginia since the colonial period, whereas in North Carolina, which is next door, free men of color lose the right to vote in 1835. So the idea of disfranchisement in North Carolina wasn't new in 1835, and people had actually tried to do it before, but politically they weren't successful until 1835.
To go back to your point about the local enforcement of laws, it really seems like you could have had a situation, and perhaps you found a situation like this in your research. It seems like you could have a situation where free people of color were highly valued and respected members of their community. And so when a state like Virginia or North Carolina passes some sort of discriminatory law, I think I could see examples, or imagine examples, I should say, where an individual community might be really hard pressed to actually enforce that discriminatory law on someone that they saw was their friend and neighbor. Do you think this really happened? Did you find cases where this might have happened, where local communities might have actually ignored state laws because, on a personal level, they didn't actually want to discriminate against their neighbors who happened to be a free person of color?
Yes, definitely. I think that's playing a role in this situation. And I think you could even add a class element to that question or that way of thinking about the situation of free people of color, because I would say it's less likely for a well-to-do free person of color to face criminal punishment from a locality than, say, a poor free person of color. And some laws are actually designed so that that would be the outcome. So there are penalties that can be assessed against free people of color for a variety of different crimes. And often what happens, especially as we get closer to the Civil War period, is that certain fines will be attached to a crime with the intent of trying to make a poor free person of color be hired out. That's what they would call it. So basically you would temporarily lose your freedom. You would be hired out at auction for a certain amount of years to pay off your debt. And so what the courts would do is they would assess really high fines that the people couldn't pay. And then they would end up being hired out. Whereas if you're a well-to-do free person of color, they're not likely to do that to you anyways. But even if they did, you have the money to pay it off. $50, oh, I can pay that. Whereas for a poor person in that time period, $50 is a lot of money. So we see that kind of stuff. But then there's also another element of this local variation in the ways that discriminatory laws are used by local officials. And that has to do with the larger economy and the desire to maybe get around the law by local officials. And I think that happens, especially when we're thinking about immigration and the movement of people. I think there's some entities that want to ignore the rules because they find it financially beneficial to allow free people of color who may be coming in from another state to come and do work because they can pay them less. That's how they're looking at it. Just like what we see with our immigration rules today and how they work. Some people are willing to look the other way and not pay attention because it's financially beneficial to somebody else.
As we're on the theme of local and regional variations in the treatment of people of color, there were some states that came into the Union, and particularly into the southern part of the United States, that didn't originate in the British American structure of government. So you mentioned New Orleans and Louisiana a bit earlier, and that's such a great example because Louisiana had Spanish and French origins and therefore had different laws with regards to manumission, race, and slavery. So what kinds of variations did states like Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, or Mississippi have when it came to the treatment and laws for people of color, given that these states all came out of French and Spanish colonial traditions of thinking about race and servitude?
So I think, like you said, the manumission rules in the Spanish Empire in particular, which would have affected Florida and Louisiana and parts of some of those other states as well. The variation in those rules created opportunity for larger populations of free people of color to spring up in those areas compared to, say, areas of the Deep South that would have been part of the British Empire immediately before the Revolution. The manumission rules are where you see the major difference, but once those areas become incorporated into the United States, the laws tend to harden pretty quickly as far as attempts to control the lives of free people of color. There's a little bit of flexibility in Louisiana to some extent because there's a large population of free people of color in New Orleans. Some of them are pretty well to do. And so I think because of that, they're able to shield themselves to some extent. But where there's smaller populations of free people of color, I think it becomes more difficult to protect themselves and to create an open environment for free people of color. And I'll think about Florida when I'm thinking about that. Florida was part of the Spanish Empire, so was Louisiana. But by the time you're getting into the mid 1800s, Florida's not that great of a place for free people of color, especially Florida. If you're thinking about the larger state of Florida, there are little pockets of free people of color sprinkled in places like Pensacola and St. Augustine. But outside of that, the populations of free people of color are very small or non-existent, and they don't have much to work with when it comes to protecting themselves. And actually, there's a important migration of people who leave Florida and go off to places like Mexico and the Caribbean at different times.
So what was it like to be a free person of color living in the South in the early United States? It sounds like from our conversation, we would have had different laws that we would have had to contend with and follow, that some of these laws would have restricted our movements and dictated our public behavior. So if we're a free person of color living and working on, say, a farm, because you said most free people of color lived in rural areas of the South, if we're living and working on this southern farm, what would our lives have been like?
Again, I emphasize this throughout my book. I think that when we're trying to describe the experiences of free people of color, we have to look at the larger context for each of these individuals because it says a lot about how they would experience life, whether it's in an urban area or in a more rural area. So again, if you're a well-to-do free man of color in a rural part of the South, and you own your own land, have your own business, you can do pretty well. I mean, some of the most successful free people of color in the South live in what I would describe as probably some of the states that a free person of color would be least likely to want to live in, like Mississippi, like certain parts of Louisiana and South Carolina. that's where the well-to-do free people of color are, because they are engaged in using slave labor, like many of their neighbors, to make a living, and they're able to do very well in many cases because they are more focused on making money than they are on worrying about forms of discrimination that may surround them. And sometimes they can even get around that because they have money and people listen to them. They have power that's connected to that. Whereas if you are a poor, free woman of color in that same community, you're potentially suffering all the time. You don't have the same political connections. You don't have the same financial resources as those individuals. And so you don't have the same power in that community over your own life and also the lives of other people. I mean, there's some free men of color who are well to do who rent land to white people, and they use that as a way to create power for themselves in their communities. And a poor free woman of color would not be able to do that. And she also may face other problems related to the laws that, again, control the bodies and the children of poor women. The apprenticeship laws that developed in the colonial period are still in existence in many parts of the South well into the 19th century. And that affects the rights of poor free women of color, but also creates potential long-term damage for their families, because this poverty ends up being inherited, just like the wealth is inherited. The poverty goes from generation to generation too.
Given that we are talking about the South, which has the highest population of enslaved people in the United States and also the highest population of free people of color in the United States, I imagine in this situation that there may have been free people of color who wanted to actually form a relationship with an enslaved person. Perhaps they wanted to marry them or have children with them. How did free people of color navigate this situation where they might have been free, but their love was actually enslaved?
Definitely. So you do have free people of color who marry enslaved people. Sometimes these are free people of color were enslaved themselves and were manumitted earlier in life and then ended up marrying somebody enslaved, or maybe they were already married while they were enslaved and that individual became free, but the partner is not free. So they're having to deal with that. And free people of color, again, they navigate these relationships in a variety of different ways. So there's some free people of color, especially men, who are tradespeople who are able to save up enough money to buy their enslaved family members, whether it's a spouse or children, and they basically are able to control their families in some way. Whereas you have other free people of color who maybe are unable to do that, and they have to compromise quite a bit. I discuss a couple of examples in my work about free men of color who were married to enslaved women who ended up having to follow these enslaved women in different parts of the South. So say they were based in North Carolina when their relationship began, but then the enslaver of the spouse decides to move to Alabama and take the family of this free person of color with him. And so the free person of color has to tag along and go to Alabama, which is illegal in many cases because they're not supposed to actually move into Alabama. And they're also giving up potentially their citizenship rights or at least their residency rights in North Carolina. And so it creates a lot of trouble for some free people of color, especially those that are poor.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that when you're involved in this type of relationship where one person's free and another is enslaved, that you may even question whether you want to have children, because in the United States, slavery followed the line of the mother. So if you're a free man of color and you have children with your enslaved partner, then your children would have been enslaved.
Yeah, I think it was a problem for some people. And I think what you will see is that these men who are in these types of relationships, if they do have the money, the first thing they try to do is buy their children as they're being born. And the problem becomes that, sometimes you end up with too many children. You just can't keep up with freeing your kids, or you end up in a situation where your spouse is being enslaved, somebody who's not going to cooperate with you and engage with you. And so I think the maybe larger impact of this is that we actually see a lot of free people of color who will have nothing to do with enslaved people in this type of situation. They will not marry them. They won't associate with them because ultimately, if you do, there are all these negative, potentially long-term impacts that come along with being engaged in a relationship with an enslaved person.
I wonder if we could talk a bit more about the development of laws that would have prevented free people of color from moving about the early United States. I know you mentioned this earlier, Warren, but there were some states that prohibited free people of color from moving into their states. And we just discussed that there were free people of color who married enslaved women. And it was therefore possible for their enslaver to take their wife and possibly their children from North Carolina to Alabama. And then that free spouse legally wouldn't have been able to follow them. So could you tell us a bit more about the different laws that were being passed to restrain free people of color from moving about the early United States and how free people of color navigated these laws?
Yeah, usually these laws will say a free person of color can come into this state and conduct business or something like that for, say, 30 days, and then they need to leave. Or on the opposite side, you'll have laws that will say a free person of color who may have been born, let's just say in North Carolina, if that free person of color leaves the state for more than 30 days or more than 60 days, then that person loses residency and then can't come back to the state. These are the kinds of laws that pop up in different parts of the South. And the exact language and time periods change over time. And what we do see is that by the time we get to the Civil War, there is a greater emphasis on making punishments for, say, leaving the state and coming back or coming into the state illegally more harsh. So the punishments may not actually be defined in the law early on, but over time they become defined, and it may be, oh, you're going to be hired out for a certain amount of time if you come illegally into the state. Something that's just more harsh, trying to dissuade free people of color from entering states in the first place. That's what we see.
Thinking now about the antebellum period, which is that period right before the Civil War, do we still see local communities protecting their well-to-do free people of color or their free men of color by turning a blind eye to some of these really restrictive laws?
Yeah, so what you'll see sometimes is petitions coming from local people. They'll be sent to the state assembly requesting an exemption from the law. And often these petitions will say, X free person of color has lived in this community for so many years, because often these laws aren't enforced immediately. They're enforced 20 years later or 7 years later, something like that. And so the petition will say, this person has lived in this community for a long time, has contributed to this community in this way, has a family in this community, et cetera, et cetera. Can you please allow this person to stay? And sometimes those requests are granted and sometimes they're not.
As I think about movement, because we are talking about a society that has both free people of color and enslaved people, I'm curious about the dangers that free people of color may have had as they tried to protect their freedom and also move about the United States. So could you tell us about the story of Solomon Northup and how typical or atypical his story was?
Solomon Northup was from the North. He was from New York specifically. And during a visit to Washington, D.C., he was kidnapped and illegally enslaved. He was transported through Virginia to New Orleans and sold in New Orleans and enslaved in Louisiana for over a decade. And eventually he is able to recover his freedom because he's able to get a letter out to people in New York, letting them know that he had been kidnapped and was still alive. And somebody came down from New York and recovered him. And so I would say that the fact that he was recovered is unusual, but his kidnapping was a bit more common, sadly. From the early national period in particular, we see this development in trade in free people of color. And I think part of what's going on is that enslaved people are expensive and free people are free if you can catch one and enslave that person and sell them illegally. And so there are some individuals who are working in the upper South and even in parts of the North, kidnapping free people of color and selling them into bondage. And I would say that from what I can see, we don't have numbers on this because, of course, this trade is illegal, right? But just glancing through the evidence, it seems that children in particular were targets of this illegal traffic because children often don't know a lot about their own backgrounds. They're relatively easy to kidnap compared to adults. It's very hard to kidnap a grown man just off of the street in a way that it may be easier to kidnap a child. And in the case of Solomon Northup, he actually was drugged in order to kidnap him. So it was a very elaborate plan that took place to kidnap Solomon Northup versus some stories of children are simply cases where a person may offer a job, a piece of candy, something of that nature that doesn't require as much elaborate planning to take these children away. So, yeah, it's definitely a problem throughout the region. I know looking through governor's papers in different states, I've seen cases that reached governors from maybe one southern state to another claiming that a resident free person of color had been kidnapped and sent to, say, Texas or Louisiana, and the governor of maybe an upper South state is asking for the recovery of this free person of color. So we know that it's going on. There are newspaper ads that relay these stories as well. So it's a problem. And I think in certain ways, Northup's story is common because he did spend quite a long period of time in Louisiana. But at the same time, his story is unique because he was able to write about it after the fact that he was recovered.
Leslie wonders how vigilant a free person of color needed to be when it came to kidnappers and being sold into slavery. Would you tell us about the different techniques or tactics free people of color employed to protect their freedom?
Again, I think it depends on where you're located. If you're in a city, you're probably in a more dangerous situation than, say, if you're in a rural area, although there are kidnappings that take place in rural areas. And I think part of that is that when you're in a city, there's just so many more strangers. People tend to engage in business with people that they don't know. Whereas in a more rural community, everybody knows everybody to some extent. And so it's just much more difficult to be a kidnapper and come into a rural community and people not be aware that you are in that area and at least be somewhat suspicious of you, ask questions of you. So in that sense, community plays a really important role in protecting free people of color from kidnapping, right? The fact that you know who everybody is in your community to a certain extent helps keep you safe. And often when rural communities are exposed is when there's somebody within the community that is involved in the kidnapping. So I mentioned an example or two where there are individuals from the community who are kidnapping other people, and then they take that individual outside of the community and try to traffic them. And so that's how those free people of color end up in trouble potentially.
I probably should have asked this a bit earlier, but since we are on the topic of communities, in both of your books, Warren, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Beyond Slavery's Shadow, you note that early American communities really needed free people of color to live in their communities. And I wonder if you would tell us about this need and how free people of color fit within the communities that they lived in.
Free people of color, when we're thinking about their role in the economy, are playing a variety of different parts. So you have some free people of color who are doing basically the grunt work of the community. They're common laborers, they're ditch diggers, they're servants, they're doing that type of work. And then you have other free people of color who have been trained in a certain skill or a certain trade, and they're able to have an impact in their community in that way. So, say in the colonial period, we're talking about the local blacksmith, or we're talking about the barrel makers, the wheelwrights, people of that nature who might be free people of color. And then as we get into the 19th century, we see an even larger number of trades that free people of color are involved in. And free people of color are even involved in things like money lending. So there are people who are debtors to free people of color and depend on them for access to cash and things of that nature. So, yeah, free people of color are important to their communities in every different level. And one example that I can think of from my book that might be helpful in explaining the importance of free people of color comes from Virginia. And there's a case where a free man of color is a gunsmith. And apparently he's the only gunsmith in the area for two different counties. And Virginia passes a law basically limiting the access of free people of color to guns. But the gunsmith is a free person of color in this community, and the people are like, we need this guy to stay around, and we need him to keep working on our guns. And apparently, even after Virginia limits the rights of free people of color to hold weapons, he's still in business, because what are the people going to do? They need their guns to hunt, to protect their houses, all of those kind of things. And so they're, again, willing to look the other way because this guy is so essential to their day-to-day lives.
That's another great example of states passing laws and locals deciding, no, I don't think we're going to enforce that law, or we're going to enforce it in a very different way.
Exactly.
Now, when we think of free people of color living in urban communities, we tend to think of the institutions they established. Schools, churches, mutual aid societies, or welfare organizations. You know, those organizations where free people of color in the community would have pulled all their resources together so that they could help members of their community when they hit a rough patch. Did you find this to be the case in rural areas of the South, Warren? Did free people of color who lived in rural areas of the South have similar opportunities to create institutions that would have helped improve and better their lives in their local communities?
Yeah, absolutely. We see schools in certain rural parts of the South for free people of color. Often free people of color have to create their own schools because they're excluded from public schools when they do exist. And in many parts of the South, there are no public schools. And so free people of color have to find ways to educate their children on their own. So they either create schools or they hire tutors for their kids if they have the financial resources to do so. And there are also churches created by free people of color in some rural parts of the South, especially parts of the Upper South, places like Maryland. You'll find these rural churches. Some areas of Virginia, North Carolina, there are rural churches created by free people of color for their exclusive use. And in these places, they're able to have a little bit more autonomy as far as deciding how the church is going to operate and having political positions within the churches, because that's, I think, the problem for many free people of color and why they decide to create their own institutions is because they're not allowed to have positions of power within churches in which white people are part of the congregation.
Yeah, could we talk a bit more about churches? Because when we do talk about communities of free people of color, churches are most often the institution that come up as playing the most important role in these communities. So could you tell us a little bit more about churches and their role in these rural communities of the South?
Yeah, well, I think in certain cases, these churches become the base for many of their larger social interactions with one another. Thinking especially about places such as Baltimore, the church is not just a religious center, but it also hosts some of the schools. Social organizations come out of the churches, and some of those are specifically church related, but also you see during the temperance movement, temperance organizations coming out of churches. You see social gatherings coming out of churches. Church clubs often do fundraising for different community activities. So the churches in that sense are central to the general social operations of free people of color who, again, often are not given the opportunity to interact as equals with their white neighbors. So they have to find spaces for themselves in order to fulfill their needs.
Warren, you have researched and written 2 books about the lives and experiences of free people of color in the South. Today we've been talking broadly about North Carolina's free people of color and Beyond Slavery's Shadow. Given all of the different research you've done about these people's lives, is there an aspect of the history of free people of color in the South that you really wished more people knew about?
Well, I think I want people to take away from the story of free people of color is that freedom is something that, at least in the U.S. context, exists on a spectrum. It's not a single status, a single experience. Sometimes I think we like to think of freedom as black and white. There's slavery and there's freedom. But we see from the situation of free people of color that freedom can be a lot of different things. It can be the struggles of the poor free person of color struggling to control his or her family and make a living. And it also can be the story of the successful free man of color who's a voter in North Carolina and an enslaver as well. All of those experiences fit under freedom, just like our current situation. We have people who are described as free in this country who experience freedom in very different ways.
Well, let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, in his books, Warren notes that in 1791, armed slaves overthrew the French colonial government of Saint-Domingue and established the new independent country of Haiti. In his research, Warren found that white Americans responded to the Haitian Revolution by placing legal restrictions on free people of color at home in the United States. Warren, in your opinion, what might have happened if the Haitian Revolution had failed? How might life have been different for the free people of color who lived in the early United States?
Well, I think the most obvious difference would be the situation of free people of color in Louisiana. Large percentage of the free people of color in Louisiana came there as a result of the revolution. So it's very possible many of them would not have come. Many of them also came bringing their wealth, including the people they enslaved. So I think it would have totally restructured the economic impact of free people of color in New Orleans and probably in Louisiana as a whole. And I can imagine that that would have led to maybe a faster denigration of their rights in Louisiana than what happened in reality, because they wouldn't have had the social connections necessarily to uphold their status in the way that they were able to, at least at the local level. So I think that's where we see the greater impact. In the rest of the South, I don't know. I mean, there are free people of color who left that region and came to Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia and places like that as well. But they were much smaller in number. And ultimately, I don't think that it would have had a significant impact. But again, who really knows? Because as far as the way that I focus on the revolution in the context of the more broader South, the revolution is being used by politicians as a way to restrict the movement of free people of color. And I think at the end of the day, those restrictions would have appeared, whether it appeared in the 1790s or later in the 19th century. I think they would have come about and been strengthened, because what I try to explain is that politicians often come up with ways to discriminate against free people of color, but they need the right opportunity to implement those restrictions. And so the revolution ultimately becomes a opportunity for them to implement ideas that they probably had before the revolution took place.
So what's next for you, Warren? Have you started a new research project yet? Or are you still thinking about working on free people of color in the South?
I'm still working on that. I'm thinking that I'll probably continue looking at the lives of free people of color. There's, I think, a lot to uncover, especially making some of these connections between the experiences of free people of color in the South and those in the North, getting a better understanding of the development of discrimination against free people of color in both regions and how those forms of discrimination may be connected or not connected. So I think that I will probably go into some of that in the future, but I'm still thinking.
And how can we get in touch with you if we have more questions?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at WE_Miltier. I also have a website, warrenmiltier.com, and you can find more about me and my work there.
Warren Miltier Jr., thank you for joining us and for providing us with an overview of the experiences of free people of color in the early United States and in the early American South.
Thank you so much for having me.
Freedom is not a black and white concept. It's not a black and white concept today, and it certainly wasn't a straightforward, evenly applied, or inclusive concept in early America. But by taking the time to explore different experiences with freedom throughout the history of the United States, we can better understand how our modern day ideas about freedom and who should be allowed to enjoy the right to speak, act, move, and participate in our democratic process, how those ideas developed. This is why it was great for us to speak with Warren. Warren's research on free people of color between the British colonial period of North American history and the United States' Civil War offers us a window through which we can see the different ways in which freedom exists as a spectrum. Now, where early Americans fell on the spectrum of freedom really depended on many factors. As Warren mentioned, a person's race, gender, wealth, trade skills, and whether they own land and enslaved people all played a big role in determining someone's freedom and their place within their community. Take the example Warren shared with us of the Virginia gunsmith. The gunsmith was a free man of color, and his knowledge and skill as a maker and fixer of firearms was seen as so valuable that when the state of Virginia passed a law to prohibit people of color from owning, bearing, or handling firearms, the gunsmith's community said, "No way, we're not going to follow and enforce this law. Our gunsmith is just too important and too respected by our community to enforce that restriction." And this flexibility in the application of laws is something that came up again and again throughout our conversation with Warren. If a community really respected a free person of color as a member of their community, then that community often shied away from enforcing laws that tended to discriminate and limit the freedoms of those valued free people of color. Now, while variation and flexibility certainly existed in local law enforcement, we shouldn't forget that bigotry and discrimination lived everywhere in the early United States. No one ever had as many rights as elite white men. But being able to see that there was flexibility in the application of laws and freedom really allows us to see and better understand the complexity and varied experiences that all sorts of Americans had with freedom. You'll find information about Warren, his 2 books, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Beyond Slavery's Shadow, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/328. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.